So at the outset, on behalf of Arivu Pro Academy, I would like to welcome one and all for this particular course, and we are about to begin. So as you can see on screen, this CA Foundation has quite a number of papers for you to clear, and paper 2, and that too section B of paper 2 is business correspondence and reporting. Now this is the course, this is the paper that I am going to deal with. Now you may wonder, why have I written this particular thing, day 1, session 1 and 2? Now considering that this is a 3-hour session on a daily basis, and we are also trying to cover the entire syllabus in a span of 10 days, we are trying to give you in sessions. So session 1 is on now, and then there will be a gap of 15 minutes at the end of session 1, and then after 15 minutes break we will start with session 2. Okay, so like I said, there are a few instructions that I wanted you to remember. The second instruction that I want you to be particular about is, please ensure that you have a notebook or papers and a pen or a pencil so that you can jot down those important points that I am trying to tell you, so that at a later point in time, when we throw open the session for questions and answers, then you can post your questions and then I will be able to sort of answer those questions that you post here, right? So with these few preliminary instructions, let us begin with the first session. All right, as you can see on screen, the objective not of this particular session, but the objective of this particular paper 2, section B, business correspondence and reporting, is just given here. The objective is to acquire. Now what do you mean by acquire? You learn, all right, you acquire, and thereafter you develop. So to acquire and to develop good communication skills. Now this is where I want you to be specifically focusing on. Now what do you mean by good communication skills? Each one of you is blessed with communication skills, but there is a need for us to develop that communication skills that we have to good and better, and thereafter also try and make it best. Okay, so you may ask me a question, isn't our communication skills good? It is good, but perhaps there is a need for us to strengthen it further. All right, so what is required, what is a requisite for this particular good communication skills to acquire is business correspondence and reporting. Let's proceed forward. So what I've tried telling you is, business correspondence and reporting is a requirement for you to ensure that you acquire and develop good communication skills. So that's the basic point, and that also is the objective of this particular section B of paper 2. Now this is exactly what the course pack or the contents of this particular paper deals with. There are about 13 different modules or 13 different lessons that we are going to deal with in about 20 sessions, or to be precise, 10 days. The first chapter is communication. The second chapter is sentence types, direct and indirect speech, and active and passive voice. The third lesson is vocabulary, that is root words, synonyms, antonyms, prefixes, suffixes, phrasal verbs, collocations, and idioms. So these are the large structures that we are going to deal with when it comes to the lesson of vocabulary. The fourth lesson is comprehension passages. The fifth lesson is note making. The 6th lesson is Introduction to Basic Writing. The 7th lesson is Prezi Writing. The 8th lesson is Article Writing. The 9th lesson is Report Writing. The 10th lesson is Writing Formal Letters. The 11th lesson is Writing Formal Mails. The 12th lesson is Resume Writing. And the 13th lesson is on Meetings. So these are the 13 contents or the 13 lessons that we are going to deal with for the next 10 days, right? So with that, shall we begin? Yeah, so the weightage of marks for this particular paper is 40 marks. As I mentioned right in the beginning, that this particular paper is part of paper 2 and section B. Section A is of 60 marks and section B is of 40 marks. And the 40 marks modules are what we have seen in the previous slide. So it's for 40 marks and it is going to be multiple choice questions based type, right? So that's the question paper that you will be able to see. All right. So let's begin. So I would like to reiterate that the weightage of marks is 40 for this particular paper and it is going to be multiple choice based, right? So remember this. So let's begin with what we will be discussing for the next 2.5 hours. So chapter 1 is titled Communication. And so in this particular chapter on communication, we are going to see all these 7 different modules that are jotted down here. The types of communication, directions for communication, network or networks in communication, process in communication, problems in communication, barriers to communication, and then types of communication. Now, when you talk about types of communication, there are going to be 3 different subsets to it: interpersonal skills, listening skills, and emotional intelligence. So these are the 3 things that come under the types of communication, right? So let me repeat one more time for your understanding. We are going to see these 7 modules in chapter 1 on communication. That is types, directions, network, process, problems, barriers, and types of communication. So let's get started. Now, remember that in our lives, we all have goals. The goal that you are now aspiring to is to become a chartered accountant. And in order to become a chartered accountant, there is something called as a process. All right. In order to achieve your goal, there are certain processes that you will have to go on. And then based on those processes, if you are able to fine-tune yourself and channelize yourself in the right context, definitely you will be able to achieve your goals. So in a similar context, when we talk about communication with regards to business corresponding and report writing, you will see that there are certain goals that are expected of you to ensure that you become a positive communicator, a good communicator, and so on and so forth. So the first thing is explain. So you must explain the process of communication. How does the process of communication takes place? How does it take place? So that's the first thing. After explaining, I think there is a need for us to recognize the types of communication. And after recognizing the types of communication, you will have to understand and apply varied structures and networks in communication. And then thereafter, there is a need for us to use the techniques of skills to be communicated. I beg your pardon, there is a slight error in this particular slide. It is techniques of skills to be communicated, not skilled. All right. So techniques of skills to be communicated, and then recognize and address barriers in communication. So there are definitely going to be all these things. So first, you need to understand that a communication is definitely a process. And then you're also supposed to try and recognize the different types of communication possible. and how you are able to understand and apply the various structures that go into communication, and what are those networks that are possibly essential for us in this communication process, and those techniques that are required for you to use to update your language skills or communicational ability, and finally recognize and address those barriers in communication. Now, the barriers that we have seen right at the beginning is we were supposed to start at 4, but then there was a delayed start because of technical glitch, and then there were also disturbances as and when people were entering and they were not necessarily muting themselves. So these are all barriers, and these barriers will definitely result in hampering of the communication process. So these are things that I want you to understand, the goals that are required for you to be a good communicator. So please remember, the key is, how do you become a good communicator? Let's move on further. Introduction to communication. Now, when you talk about introduction to communication, the word communication definitely has an etymology, right? It definitely has an etymology, and you can see that this particular word communication emerges from the Latin language, and the specific word that you can see on screen is communicare, meaning to share, right? So you share ideas, you share thoughts, you share feelings, you share emotions, and you also share information. So it is exchange. Now, when you say to share, it's not a one-way process. It's a two-way process, and in some contexts, it's multiple in nature. So this particular to share is not a single component, but it's a process. All right. So you exchange information, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And that is what is called communication, which derives its root from the Latin word communicare. Now, how do you communicate? You communicate through speech, you communicate through signals, you communicate through writing, you communicate through your behaviors. All these are very important. How do you speak? How do you send across certain signals? How do you write? And what is the behavioral pattern that you're trying to exhibit to ensure that your audience is able to able to understand your communication? Now, in one sense, you can see that there is a communication process that is taking place between me and all of you seated there and listening to what I have to say. So in communication process, there is a sender, which has a technical term called the encoder, who encodes a message. All right, whatever I speak is a message. And then using a medium or a channel, all right, in this particular platform, it's a Zoom platform, and through technological devices, there is a communication that is being sent across. And that's the medium or the channel through which I send across the message, or the academy sends across the message to the receiver, or what you call in technical terms decoder, who decodes. I mean, each of you seated there is decoding what I am presenting to you, who decodes the message, the context, the content. And after processing the information, meaning to say you try and hear, you try and listen to each of those ideas carefully, and you're trying to process what I'm speaking, what I'm trying to communicate with everybody. And then you send across appropriate feedback or reply using a medium or channel. So just a moment back, we saw somebody saying that the screen is blurred. Your audio is not audible. And so that's the feedback or the reply or a response that I got from some of you people there. And so that is being sent across once again through a medium or channel. And in this context, it is through the chat box, which is available for you, and you're able to sort of type the messages and responses as a response to what I'm communicating. So as a speaker, as an encoder, I am able to understand whether you have understood what I've spoken so far. So this is exactly what you will have to understand with regards to introduction to communication. Let's move on. Now, when we talk about communication, there are 8 main steps. All right, please get it clear. There are 8 main steps that you will have to understand, that you will have to remember when it comes to communication. The first one, the purpose or reason for the communication. Now, in this context, I am trying to communicate with you for a purpose, for a reason. And that purpose or the reason is to try and train you, equip each one of you seated there to ensure that you understand all those prerequisites when it comes to this particular paper on business correspondence and reporting, so that you will be able to execute this not by listening alone, but thereafter read and practice over a period of time, so that when the examination approaches, you will be well prepared to take the exam or give the exam. So that's the first thing, purpose or a reason for any communication. So without a purpose, there is no communication that is possible. The second one, the contents of the message. Please don't pronounce it as content. There is a difference between content and content. All right, I am contented with what is happening in the class. I am contented by the fact that the students are silently listening to what I have to say. Whereas the contents of this particular chapter on communication is what needs to be understood in this particular aspect. The contents of the message. The third one, the medium used for conveying the message. The medium used for conveying the message. So there could be multiple mediums that you use to communicate. And look at some of the examples that are there in the slide. Internet is one mode of communication. Written text is one form of communication. You remember in olden days, letter writing, preceding letter writing, there was this particular tradition of, pigeons being sent across from one kingdom to another in order to pass on the information. So there was a lot of evolvement when it comes to communication that is being sent from one place to another over a period of time. So the medium used for conveying the message, internet, written text, speech. What I'm trying to do now is speaking to you and I'm communicating with you. Pictures. All right. Pictures definitely send across 1,000 meanings. And that's why there is always an understanding that audio, visuals definitely communicate far better than someone speaking, right? It may depend on scenarios, but that is something that you'll have to remember. Gestures. Apart from trying to look at you in this particular platform where I can't necessarily see all the 127 of you seated, I try and articulate, or I try and gesture certain things to complement my speech pattern. And so there could be several other mediums in which you try and convey the message. Transmitting the message. Right? Now in this particular context, the message is being transmitted through internet, through online technology. All right? And so that is how you try and transmit the message. And then messages are often misinterpreted due to external disturbances. Yes, there are definitely external disturbances. And in this particular platform, there is bound to be external disturbances. Probably you are staying at home and your parents are also trying to, do their own work. And they may also be talking. And that may necessarily, try and seek your attention, and you may get distracted. There could be several other external disturbances. Probably your house is located on a mount and there is a tree outside your window and there is a bird chirping, and probably that could definitely be a disturbance in that context, right? And so there are so many external disturbances: noise created by humans, traffic, natural forces like rain, when there is thunder, All these are natural forces that can definitely interrupt and disturb your communication. These factors can result in what is something that you will have to understand: miscommunication. We definitely tend to miscommunicate, right? Yeah, some of you people had asked me questions, so let me take that question and then thereafter we'll move on. So some of you are asking me if we will be sending across notes. Perhaps this particular PPT that is visible on screen for you guys, we'll definitely send it across. But I would definitely ask you people to definitely take down notes. Please take down notes, all right? And furthermore, you could definitely try and, read further, understand further by the PPT. All right, so that is something that we will have to remember. All right, so shall we proceed forward? Okay. Yes, if you have the text with you and if you want to mark, you can definitely mark it down. No problem whatsoever. All right, so okay, so if this paper is subjective and not MCQs, I beg your pardon. I will once again clarify it because there's some sort of a doubt in that, whether it's an MCQ paper or a subjective paper, which I will clarify it probably after the break. All right, and if it is a subjective paper, then all the more reasons why you should have more understanding of it rather than just, getting to know the context alone. All right, so I was talking to you about messages often getting misinterpreted because of external disturbances. And these external disturbances definitely try and ensure that there is some miscommunication between the people who are listening to someone talk. So in that particular context, I think when the communication process takes place, receiving the message is also very essential, much like how you try and send across the message. And that's why you remember right in the beginning I told you that it's a two-way process. And so you can't take it lightly that, the person who's talking there will definitely give us the information. I can take it lightly? No. And that's the reason why I very clearly told you right in the beginning, there is a need for you to write down some points that you remember, that you think, that you recollect as important points. And then when you try and revise it, you will be able to understand it better. So receiving the message is equally important as much as trying to send across the message. Deciphering and making sense of the message, that is decoding. Now, receiving is not decoding completely. After receiving, you try and decipher. Now, I'll give you an example. When I say tree, not everybody remembers mango tree. Not everybody remembers a guava tree. Not everybody, remembers a neem tree. There is a possibility that each one of you would understand the term tree in your own ways. So going by that, you can see that each one tries to decipher a particular message and make sense. And you need to make sense in a meaningful manner. You need to make sense in a meaningful manner, and that's decoding. And the last main point that I want you to remember is interpreting and figuring out what the receiver thinks is the real message, right? So Gagandeep asks me, what is deciphering? The process of trying and understand what is being conveyed. Now, when I say tree, you listen to the word tree and then you try and decipher. Did he say tree, or did he say mango tree, or did he say guava tree? And then thereafter you try and decipher all these things and then you make sense of it. And that is called the process of deciphering. Right? I hope Gagandeep, you understood that. And the last point, interpreting and figuring out what the receiver thinks is the real message. So the real message that I am trying to communicate with you is on the chapter communication. And the communication chapter has several modules that we are discussing, and we are now on the verge of completing the first topic, introduction to communication. And in the process of introduction to communication, there are 8 major steps, 8 main steps that you will have to remember so that you try and understand all the other facets that we are going to develop further. This is exactly what the main steps, the 8 main steps of communication is. Figuring out, you try and understand, you try and figure out, you try and understand what exactly is the meaning of that particular thing, right? Interpret. Now, for example, I say the word coin, C-O-Y, coin. Now, you receive the message coin and you try and decipher. The process of deciphering is, what is the meaning of the word coin? I've never really heard the word coin before. And so you try and make sense of it. And so how do you make sense of it? You definitely go back to a dictionary and you try and find out what exactly is the meaning of the word koi. And then you try and interpret it. Okay, koi is someone who is, right, probably not ashamed, but sometimes you have this coy feeling. All right, you are shy about certain things. Certain people don't necessarily have the guts to face the audience because they are simply shy, right? So you interpret and figure out that, is this the meaning of the word coy? And then you try and understand the real message of what coy means. Coy means shy, a shy person, a coy person. So this is how you understand communication. Yeah, pretending to be shy or shy, both are correct, Vasu. Right? So Nikita, I hope you understand the meaning of figuring. Let's move on further. Is there anybody who has questions thus far? If you want to ask me questions so far, you can just type your questions there. I will answer it. Or if you don't have questions, let me move on to the next module. All right. Now, process of communication. Whatever we have learned so far, the process, the overall process that gets involved in this communication is something that is pictorially represented in the form of a picture I have represented here. Number 1, source. What is source? The person who sends across the message is the source. This information has been passed on from the source. The teacher, the instructor, the internet, the book. These are all sources. And then excoding. All right? Or what you call encoding. Encoding and excoding. All right? So the sender is the source. The excoder is nothing but excoding or the encoding process. That is language that I am trying to use. In this context, it's the English language that I speak. And then thereafter, there is a channel in which I try to communicate. Online platform, Zoom. And then you try and decode it by seeing my picture on screen, my video on screen, and my audio is also visible because perhaps you're using a microphone, or maybe you're using a earphone, or the sound is audible for you, and then you are trying to receive the message as the receiver. The receiver is a person who is seated on the other end, right? So the message being sent across, and as a response I get a feedback, and this is what is called the context, or what you call the process of communication represented through a picture. So whatever we have seen so far, the 8 main steps and the entire process that involves in this particular facet called communication is something that is seen here in this pictorial representation. Now let's move on to the next topic, types of communication. Now when we talk about types of communication, there are a few things that you will have to understand. Now look at the slide. So there are a few words that I have typed in block letters, or what you call capital letters. And then there are other certain words as well. Can the process of communication be done without a channel? I don't think so. Right? Anything and everything is definitely a channel. For example, in this context, the online platform called Zoom is the channel. For example, if you would have registered the course and there was no pandemic called COVID-19, you would have all been here in the academy. And so through the academy, we would have had a face-to-face conversation. This face-to-face conversation is also a channel. The space is the channel through which this communication is being sent and received, and that's the process of communication. So there is no context that I can, definitely think of without a channel. I hope I have answered Manjunath's question. Right. So when we talk about types of communication, and when we talk about communication to be specific and precise, one of the things that you will have to understand is we need to have a good understanding. Now, how do you try and decipher? How do you try and understand this good understanding? I speak in a language that I believe that you can also understand. And I speak in a language which I believe is communicable. And I think I speak in a tone that is also communicable, in the sense that I'm loud enough. I'm also slow in my deliberation, in my dialogue delivery, or in my delivery. And so there is all these things that you will have to understand when it comes to good understanding. So if I communicate appropriately, if I communicate properly, if I communicate in a manner in which each one of you can understand, that definitely is a good understanding when it comes to the communication process. There are different types and styles of communication. There are different types and styles of communication. Now, what will happen if you have a good understanding of the different types of styles and of communication? I beg your pardon? What happens when you have a good understanding of different types and styles of communication? Let's see that one after the other. It enhances personal and professional relationships. Now, what do you mean by enhances? It tries to bridge. It tries to strengthen. All right. I'm sure you must have heard of this particular phrase called healthy relationship. When will you find that a healthy relationship develops? When you have good communication skills, when you are able to try and command respect rather than demand respect, when you try and speak in a manner that the other person understands. So enhances not necessarily personal relationships, but also professional relationships. Let's understand a few examples. Number one, when would you communicate with your parents without fear? When they are kind enough, when they have the appropriate gesture, when you know that there are certain things that you can definitely ask your parents, when you can go and approach them and personally talk to them, then you would know that these are things that I can communicate. When you can't necessarily communicate, when they are strict, then there is definitely a loss in communication because you don't go and communicate with them. So personal relationships as much as professional relationships. In the office, when you're going to work sometime in the future, there is a possibility that you may come across certain competition between you and a certain other person. And because of the competition, there is bound to be jealousy. There is bound to be some sort of a misunderstanding. And if you don't necessarily have the proper communication skills to go and sort out the issue, then your relationship with that particular person in the professional front is not going to be appropriate. So that's the first thing that you'll have to understand, enhances personal and professional relationships. The second one is resolve misunderstandings and misconceptions. Right? Each one of you is from different cultural background, different linguistic background. All right. And there is a possibility that you may not understand everything that is being communicated. Right? In a very, lighter sense of humor, I'll try and give you an example. Now, people from the northern part of India, when they come down to south for the purpose of education, for the purpose of job, and so on and so forth, you can see that when they come down south, there is a possibility that they try and encounter people who are also from the south, and each one of you try and communicate in this bridging language called English. And in the process, there are certain words from your own vernacular, from your own regional language, from your own mother tongue you try and utter. And then there is a certain misunderstanding and misconception that is possible. Example, the word chumma, C-H-U-M-M-A. In South India, when somebody utters the word chumma in any of the South Indian languages, it means just like that, simply. Right? It could be either just like that or it could be simply. All right? If somebody says, I chumma said bro, meaning I just like that said bro. Whereas people from north, in a particular language, the word chumma could mean something else. And so how do you understand it? So there is a need for you to understand. So if you utter the word chumma in an official context, in a formal context, there is a possibility that people would giggle at the word that you uttered. And so there is no scope for misunderstanding and misconception. So you need to make it clear. So when a speaker speaks, the speaker should be very clear and precise and proper and articulate the right words in the right context so that there is no misunderstanding and misconception in what is being communicated. And the last point, successful business venture and joyful personal life. So you must understand that when you talk about communication, there is nothing called personal and professional. Everywhere you need to have the right communication patterns. And if you are someone who is good at it, then definitely you can have a very successful business life, a business venture. At the same time, you can have a joyful personal life. So these are the things that you will have to remember when it comes to having a good understanding of communication and the different types and styles of communication. Now the next one, unique style of interaction. I'll give you certain examples. I'm sure some of you would have definitely heard Barack Obama speak. The manner in which he has the ability to articulate. I am sure there are several people who must have heard Smriti Irani speak. Right? The manner in which these people are able to articulate. And I'm sure there are other people as well who very uniquely try and interact. You have your own style. You have your own unique style when it comes to communication. And there is no need for you to sacrifice on that. Unless and otherwise there is a need for it, you don't have to sacrifice that particular unique style of interaction that you have. Right? Some people have the tendency of blinking their eyes constantly when they speak. Some people have the tendency of shirking whenever they speak. Some people have the tendency of, trying to smile whenever they speak. So all these are unique styles of interaction, right? They are trying to send across a message in the process of communication. And then there are manifold channels. There are innumerable number of channels through which you can communicate. And so there is a need for us to accurately interpret the message that is being conveyed by the speaker. So the receiver is equally important as much as the speaker here, because it is the responsibility of the receiver to accurately interpret the message that is being conveyed by the speaker. And because there are manifold channels, there is a possibility that communication can be misunderstood. Manifold channels meaning many channels, Ranjita. So many channels, innumerable number of channels. Right? Internet could be a channel. In internet, what channel do you use? Right? So all these are manifold channels. So you communicate through manifold channels, and there is a need for you to communicate in an accurate manner. And you're also supposed to accurately interpret the message that is being received, that is being sent across. So the receiver is equally important as much as the communicator. Now, it's not only through voice that some people try and communicate, not mere words that are being uttered. Sometimes communication is also possible through tone. All right? Sometimes it's also possible through tone. The tone with which somebody speaks. Is it a very polite tone? Is it a sarcastic tone? Is it something that's very rude? Something that is uncalled for? All these are tones. Gesture. Showing positive gesture. Showing kind gesture. All these are different things that you will have to understand and comprehend when it comes to type of communication. Yes, Nikita, what is the meaning of what? Interaction? What is that? Can you please type the word? Okay, interaction, unique style of interaction, interacting with people. You try and interact, meaning you try and talk to somebody and somebody in response talks back to you. And that is the interaction process. You get that? All right. So let's move on to the next most important thing. Now, when we talk about communication, the meaning of gesture, Jnanesh, is, try and encounter some sort of action. Action is called gesture. All right. Hand gestures. You try and shake your head. You try and nod your head. You try and wink your eyes. You try and smile. All these are gestures through which you try and communicate. All right. Manifold channels. There are innumerable number of channels that you try and communicate through. You try and communicate through manifold channels. Many channels. Manifold means many channels. Internet is a channel. Offline classroom is a channel. Online classroom is a channel. Right? Classroom under a tree is a channel. Through phone you communicate, that's a channel. Through SMS you text somebody, that is a channel. So these are multiple channels or many channels. So let's move on to the next one, types of communication. What are those broad categories through which you can try and, see these types of communication, categorize these communication? Number one, communication is based on channels. Communication is based on channels. We just saw what channels are just a moment back. Now, when we talk about communication channels, there are three different types of communication channels. The first type of communication channel is verbal channel. Verbally you communicate. Now, verbally you communicate through written mode or through oral mode. Now, what I am trying to communicate with you is oral mode, outrightly oral mode. But in the process, I have also given you a slide that you can see on screen right in front of you. That's a written mode. So, written and oral mode is verbal. Right? So, verbal means trying to communicate through words, through written mode or through oral mode. What I'm trying to do right now is communicating with you verbally, through words, orally, that is verbal. But at the same time, I have also come up with a slide so that you can understand. So that's the written mode. That's the first one. The second one is non-verbal channel. Now the non-verbal channel are of different types. Physical non-verbal pattern. Now I try and put a word, I'm trying to send across some sort of a gesture. So that's physical communication. All right. When I smile, I try and communicate physically. And then there is also paralanguage. All right. Through touch, you try and communicate certain things. Aesthetics or aesthetics. Now what is aesthetics? All right. Now when you see a picture on screen, that is aesthetic communication. It communicates through a picture. When you watch a video, it communicates through audio and visual medium. So that's aesthetics. Appearance. Appearance is very important. All right. So when somebody says a well-dressed person is someone who communicates better, because the receivers try and pay focus because of the appearance of the person. The appearance is also important. And then symbols. All right. You remember after the process of communication, I tried showing you a pictorial representation. That's symbolic of trying to explain the various process through which communication takes place. So these are non-verbal communication channels: physical, paralanguage, aesthetics, appearance, and symbols. Right, Jnanesh asked me whether it is written or visual. It is visual, it is written, it is oral as well. So this communication is of multiple perspectives, because you're seeing me on screen. At the same time, you're also able to see the slide. You can also hear me. So there are multiple channels through which this communication takes place. Yes, verbal can be written or oral, both. It can be written or oral. It can be written and oral, both. Right? So appearance, Nikita. Now, when you talk about appearance, nobody is trying to ask if somebody is beautiful or whatever it is. Right? All that they are trying to send across through appearance is that you need to appear in a very proper manner. As simple as that. Aesthetic communication and symbolic communication, what is the difference? Now, I show a picture, that is aesthetic communication. Right? So, you try and read the picture of yourself. For example, Mona Lisa's picture. What do you understand when you try and see that? So, you interpret based on the picture that you see. Whereas symbols are things that you try and use. Probably, for example, when somebody goes to a temple, how do you worship? When somebody goes to a church, how do they worship? What are those symbols that they use in order to communicate their reverence to a particular religion? Right? So these are things that you will have to understand with regards to symbols and aesthetics. Yes, if you ask me, are they both connected? Sometimes they are connected. Sometimes they are not. And it's for you to sort of understand. Paralanguage. Sometimes people use paralanguage techniques. So whenever your friend is worried, bothered, he's crying, she's weeping because, something untoward has happened, you go and, console that particular person. You touch them, you sit next to them, you hold their hand, you tell them, don't worry, this will be fine. If you have failed in your exam, there is definitely a second chance. So when you try and communicate through touch and other paralinguistic patterns, then that is paralanguage communicational channel. So with this, what we have understood so far is communication channels based categories: verbal, non-verbal, visual. All right. Now let's move on to purpose and style. Communication based on purpose and style. Now, there is a purpose why you communicate, and there is a style with which you communicate. What are those? Number one, formal. What we are trying to engage is formal communication. All right? Maybe your discussion with a friend is an informal communication. When you talk to a boss in your office, when you talk to a teacher, when you talk to an MLA or an MP of your constituency, then that's formal communication, because you don't necessarily use unofficial informal words. You can't go and pat on the back of an MLA and MP and say, look, how are you, dude? That's not possible, because it's informal, and an MLA or an MP is a formal person. He represents your constituency, and there is a certain sense of respect that that particular person receives and is supposed to be receiving, and hence you use a formal language. Now, when we talk about formal language, there are three different types of formal patterns or formal categories. Number one, vertical communication. Now, when I talk about vertical communication, it can be one way, and at times it can also be two ways, right? It can be one way or it can be two ways. Now, for example, the teacher teaches the class. The teacher interacts with students. So there are about, say, 124 students seated in this class. Now, this is vertical, one to another. And sometimes vertical communication is also two-way process. It's immediate, right? Am I sending across a message to 123 different individuals? Yes, definitely. But I'm trying to send across one single message to all the 123 or 124 people seated here. And so each one of you, I'm trying to interact personally. I'm trying to communicate personally through this particular channel. That's vertical communication, right? At times it is one way. At times it's two ways. The second one, horizontal communication. Now, what is horizontal communication? If it is vertical, it's horizontal, right? You can't speak to a teacher like the way you speak to your friend who is seated next to you. You can't speak to your father like the way you speak to your brother. But of course, that's also an informal relationship. But then there is a certain sense of decorum. There is a certain sense of demarcation that you try and encounter, that you try and exhibit, to try and demarcate, distinguish, differentiate between one relationship and the other. So that's horizontal relationship. And there is diagonal, right? So communication takes place diagonally, where there are multiple people. So I am trying to communicate with everyone, and each one is trying to sort of communicate with me in response. So that's diagonal category of communication. And then there is a second type of communication called the informal communication, based on purpose and style. When do you communicate informally? For example, you go to a birthday party, and then your entire friends are there, and you don't, shout out and say, everybody listen. And I don't think you would, make an oratory speech like, now good evening, one and all gathered here. Thank you very much for coming. It's a delightful moment that my friend is celebrating his 25th birthday. No, that's not the way in which you communicate. You communicate with that particular audience in an informal manner. There is bound to be hugging. There is bound to be, cake cutting and feeding cake to one another. At times there is a tendency that, you would want to smear the cake on your friends, and you play songs and so on and so forth. That's an informal communication. But a formal communication happens in an office space. A formal communication happens in a classroom. So these are all types of communication that you will have to understand. All right. So whenever you communicate with your boss, it's vertical communication, because you go directly and talk to him one-on-one. So that's vertical communication, right? So these are the types of communication that you must understand. So the broad categories are two broad categories. One is based on communication channels, and the other is based on purpose and style. Right? So when you talk about communication channels, there are three different patterns: verbal, non-verbal, and visual. Verbal means written. Writing a letter is a form of communication. It's a verbal communication. Right? And whatever I'm trying to encounter now is to try and speak to you people orally, through words, through action. So that's verbal communication. The second type of communication is non-verbal communication, where there is physical communication, paralinguistic communication or paralanguage communication, aesthetics communication, appearance and symbols. And then the third one is visual communication. So these are the three channels that come under communication channels. But then there are certain communication that are based on purpose and style. One is formal and the other is informal. When you talk about formal, there are three different types of formal communication: vertical communication, horizontal communication, and diagonal communication. And then there is a second type of communication called informal communication, wherein you try to talk to a few people that can be perceived as informal utterance or informal communication, right? Many of you are asking me what does it mean by demarcate. Demarcate means distinguish, differentiate. You try and separate, segregate, right? So these are all examples for the word or synonyms for the word demarcation. Horizontal communication example, Sabrish asks me. Now horizontal communication, for example, Sabrish is talking to a person like say Manish in the class. So that is horizontal communication because he is another student of your own same category, right? But horizontal communication may not necessarily apply when you speak to your boss. When you speak to your boss, it is vertical communication, up above, hierarchy. There is a certain sense of hierarchy that is being established between you and your boss. So that's a vertical form of communication. Whereas horizontal communication is equal to your own plane. Your friends, your family members, your brothers and sisters, all these people can be examples of horizontal communication. And then diagonal communication, right? It's diagonal, right? We will see that in detail in the other slides to come. Horizontal communication, definitely. Every communication is vice versa, whether you communicate in response or not. For example, I'll give you an example for vertical communication. Excuse me. So, when the boss tells you, do this work, it's a command. All that you respond is by saying yes. Or furthermore, you say yes and you nod your head. You can't say a no, or you can't shake your head and say, I can't do it. So that is called a vertical communication because sending across orders. In response, you want a one-day leave because you want to go on an excursion with your friends. And so when you try and do that, you apply for a letter, or maybe you go to your manager and speak to him personally and request him for one day's leave because you want to go on an excursion with your friend. That is also vertical communication. Okay, so the second one is horizontal, which I just explained, and the third one is diagonal, right? So multiple people. For example, there is a meeting that is being organized in your office, and then the boss says, is there any opinion that you would like to share? And say, for example, somebody like Jnanesh says, sir, I think this particular point that you spoke about can also be perceived in this particular person, in my humble opinion. Right? So that's putting forth your opinions to the various other perspectives that are being offered as part of this discussion. So that's diagonal. Whereas informal is something that you will have to understand with regards to the language that you use to communicate. Formal language, informal language, formal communication, informal communication. So it's for you to decide what is formal, what is informal. Right? So with these initial discussions, we will stop here for a 15 minutes break.